Good evening, good afternoon, everyone around the world joining today's session. My name is Cole Phelan from MaiaGrazing, and today we're really pleased to be bringing a session to everyone on gaining economic leverage with planned grazing. And it's our absolute pleasure today to have Dallas Mount from Ranch Management Consultants, RMC in the States, joining us, as well as our one and only Bart, Davidson, one of MaiaGrazing's co-founders. Now, I'm going to get out of the way pretty quickly and hand it over to Dallas first up, but today is all about really, doing better with what you've got and then really leveraging and going from there. Dallas probably doesn't really need any introduction, but he'll provide a little one-liner on himself in a moment. But today's session it's interactive. We've got hundreds of people on the call. There's going to be plenty of Q&A at the end, though we probably won't get to everything. So there'll be opportunity for you to connect with Dallas and Bart after the session. But to ask questions, just go to your little Q&A box down the bottom of the webinar browser setting there, and put your questions through, and we'll come to those towards the end. There'll be plenty of opportunity, as I said, to connect with us all afterwards. So over to you, Dallas, and thanks for joining everyone.
All right, thanks, Cole. Well, I'm glad to be here. It's fun to see the attendee box popping up over there. So I'm wondering if there's some of my friends from Australia joining in tonight. Spent some time over there a couple years ago with RCS and KLR, and made a lot of good connections. And then some of you that have traveled over here that I've met up with. So hopefully there's some friends on the call tonight. So let's jump in. I'm gonna see if I can share my screen here. So just give me a second to get the right buttons poked. And there we are. And go. Okay. Bart, if you'd give me, I can see you on my screen. If you'd give me a thumbs up, if you can see that, all right. Okay, great. Let's roll. So many of you, I think, know me, but just real briefly, I work with a company, Ranch Management Consultants. We're based here out of Wheatland, Wyoming, and we do a couple things. We teach a school called the Ranching for Profit School, which is a 7-day business management school for ranchers. And we also run a program called Executive Link, which is where we put ranchers on boards of directors for each other to work on strategic issues in business management. So our mission is healthy lands, happy families, and profitable businesses. So we're talking about your land, your families, and your business, and helping you achieve that. So I think a good, to start this off, my friend Burke Tigert, many of you know who Burke is. Burke ran Deseret Ranches for quite some time, and he's a wonderful writer, often appeared in Beef Magazine. And he wrote an article a few years ago that suggested a new paradigm for ranching. And Burke described his background, which was similar to mine, in animal science training, and it was all about the animals, right? When we were trained to look at the animals and to focus on the animals. And Burke said, it didn't take me too long being out managing these ranches to realize that it starts with the grass. And Burke described how he spent time with people that really knew quite a bit about range management, forage management, and so he really started to appreciate the forage and the grass that was growing and how to make that system healthy. And he said now he's realized that it really starts with the soil before the grass. And so Burke's suggestion for a new paradigm for ranching is soil first, then the grass, and then the livestock. So I think that's a great start for our program tonight, because it really does start at the soil. And while we're going to focus a lot on the forage, getting the soil conditions right to grow that forage, I like to think of the land and the ecology as the engine of your business. If your business is based on forage, we really have to get that engine running well. So we're going to base our whole conversation tonight on this case study, which would be similar to many folks that we get the opportunity to work with. But let's just dive in and look at it, and then we're going to have a discussion about it. So they wrote, "Dear RMC, I want to make this ranch work for me and my daughter's family who want to continue ranching with us. Well, we currently run about 400 mother cows, but there just isn't enough left over at the end of the year to support 2 families. We figured out the gross margin on the cows, and it's $425 per cow. And we think that's pretty good in this current market. we run a lean ranch and our annual overheads are still about $225,000 a year. So that leaves us about $55,000 short of covering the overheads at the current margins. Well, we follow graze half, leave half, and in the summer we run about 4 bunches, rotating them through our 20 permanent pastures. Well, I can't figure out why most of my neighbors can support 2 families on a ranch our size and why we can't seem to make it work. Well, what's missing? What's going on? Where should we start to look at this? So as we dive into this, let's remind you that there's really only 3 things that any business can do to increase profit. And I'm guessing most of you have seen this before. And if you haven't seen this, you probably know it conceptually. So this is just a basic graph here with numbers on the bottom axis there and total dollars up the vertical axis. So any ranch, any business really is going to have some fixed cost or some overhead costs. And in ranching, we talk about these as land and labor costs. So the land costs would be rent or upkeep or things like that. And then also there's maintenance costs with that, right? Fixing the roads, fixing the wells, the waters, making sure the fences are in the right stage. There's some basic utilities that are going to be there, interest cost, or some insurance costs, those types of things. So these overhead costs are the basic land and labor costs that any business is going to have. And when we talk about labor costs, we break those down into 2 things. We say it's people and things. So people would be wages or family living draw, and things are going to be all the machines that they use and all the things that go to support those machines. So any ranch is going to have your basic overhead costs. So the ranch that wrote the letter has about $225,000 just to keep the doors open on the ranch. And the next set of costs are going to be your variable costs or your direct costs. So these are the things that go up as the units of production increase. So we talk about these as interest, feed, vet, marketing, trucking, those types of things. But that feed cost for most of the ranches is going to be the largest one of the direct costs. So you add the overhead costs and the direct costs together. That's why the direct cost line is right on top there. And that gives you your total cost. So running alongside this is what we call gross product. And gross product we define as the value of your production. It's not total sales, it's the value of production. Well, think about it this way. If you keep heifer calves and don't sell them and you grow the herd, you've still produced value. Okay? You haven't produced cash income, but you've produced value. So gross product is that total sales or total value of production. So you see there where the green line crosses the blue line. If we were to draw that line straight down, there's the number of the break-even point. Okay? And that's a mistake a lot of ranches make is they focus right there on break-even. And they say, well, what's my break-even cost? And that's where the focus becomes. So when you focus on break-even, guess what you get? Well, you break even. Okay? Well, we don't want to break even. So to further look at this chart here, on the right side, as those 2 are separating, there's the target range for profit. And then on the left side, of course, is going to be loss. We had one rancher in class one time when we said, what's this zone up here looking at the green zone on the right there, the profit zone? And he answered, well, that's luck. And we said, well, what's the zone on the left, the red zone? And he said, that's normal. Okay. So if profit is too hard of a word for you to swallow, you can call that luck and you can call loss normal. And it's kind of a joke, but it's the truth because most ranches are operating at an economic loss every year. So it really is something we need to address. So let's do something about it. So let's get back to this example, okay? And I threw the numbers back here so we'd have them fresh in mind. And for the rest of our time today, let's just dive in and dissect this thing. Okay, so there's a few key numbers here that I want you to grab. So let's remember the $425 a cow and the $225,000 for the overhead costs, okay? So they're running 55,000 in the red in terms of economic costs. Okay, so we'll put a negative in front of that 55. Now he gave us some other interesting things. He said we run 4 bunches and we rotate them through 20 permanent pastures. Okay? So first thing we want to look at is if we apply this to the economic model we just saw. Okay? There's 3 things that any business can do to increase profit. Okay? So we have to figure out which of those 3 things is the issue on this ranch. Okay? And those 3 things are, if you remember the model here, okay, so we've got the overheads, the direct costs, and then the total gross product going up. So the first thing is to reduce the overheads, to find ways to make the business run leaner. Maybe it's with fewer people or maybe it's with less stuff. Okay, so can we get it all done with fewer things? Now he says in here that we run a pretty lean ranch and there's still about $225,000 $425,000 a year. So I'm going to assume that when he says we run a lean ranch, they've been pretty hard on overheads, and they've analyzed those, and they've got them as low as they want to get them, right? There's some point at which below which we wouldn't enjoy ranching anymore, okay? So let's think about where that is. And for most people, it's probably lower than they really think, okay? But so let's assume he's got his overheads as low as he wants to get them. Okay? The next way to improve profit is to improve the margin. And the margin is the space between the direct cost and the gross product. It's the relationship of those two lines, okay? A ranch with a really strong margin, as the direct cost line goes up, that gross product line is really going to go up steeply. A ranch with a weak margin, those lines are almost going to be parallel, where the direct cost line would be going up here. They wouldn't be producing much margin in the direct cost to gross product, okay? So $425 per cow is what he's saying his margin is, okay? And we think that's pretty good, is what he says here. So let's take his word for it, okay? And to be honest, I think that is a pretty strong margin, especially in today's prices that we're experiencing. So let's say, yeah, he's got a pretty strong margin business. His overheads are about as low as they can get them. So what's the third way to increase profit? Well, assuming we have a strong margin, we want to be operating as far out here as we possibly can, okay? We don't want to be running just enough units to cover our total cost. We want to be running as many units as we can on the resources that we have while improving land health. And we call that increasing turnover, okay? Essentially using the business to create turnover, to create cash flow, and to do more volume. So let's examine that for his ranch. And let's say, okay, so he's got these 4 bunches on 20 permanent pastures. So let's look into this a little bit deeper. So he's got 20 permanent pastures, and he's got 4 groups of cattle, okay? So how many pastures per herd does he have? Well, pretty easy to figure that out, right? 20 divided by 4 gives me 5 pastures per herd. Okay, so that's an important distinction there. And many people often get caught up into, well, how many pastures do I have, right? And I remember one time I was called to look at a ranch, and they said, boy, we're trying to do all this rotational grazing stuff. We're just killing ourselves out here, and we're not getting the results that we want. We're not happy with what we're seeing on the land. Well, they had 80 pastures or something like that, but I think they had like 12 herds running through them. Okay? So really finding ways to work on this number right here, the total number of herds that we're running is a lot of leverage. That's the place to start. Before you start building a single stinking fence or put any more water development in the ground, we really need to challenge how few herds can we get to? What are our stockmanship skills allow us to do? What's the class of animals that we're running? Maybe challenging those classes of animals, but what are ways we could do to reduce that? All right, so let's say he's got his 5, effectively 5 pastures per herd is what he's looking at. Now, let's see, we're going to have to make some assumptions on here. So let's say he's doing a 10-month grazing season. You guys in Australia are like, what's a grazing season? Okay, well, so he's feeding hay for 2 months out of the year. So let's say that's 300-day grazing season. Okay, he's effectively got 5 pastures per herd. So we'll take our 300 and divide it by the 5. Okay? And if he's just going through there once, then he's going to have an average of a 60-day graze period. Right? Okay. Maybe he's going through those twice a year. So he's looking at 150-day, 250-day seasons divided by the 5 would be about a 30-day graze period. Okay. So let's think about what that grazing would look like. So here's a pasture. Let's say it's a section pasture, and here we're going to have those animals. This is a water point right in the middle here. And so we're going to have those animals in there for somewhere between 30 and 60 days. Okay? So those animals are going to be pretty well spread out there, probably not getting too far from the water and grazing through that pasture like that. So in 30 days, now he said some other important things too, right? He said, I follow the graze half, leave half, okay? And if you ask him, he's probably also rotationally grazing, okay? So we've got a pasture here, and then we've got another one set over here where they're going to go to next for the next 30 or 60 days, okay? So somebody that grazes half and leave half, what do you think that looks like if we actually went out there and let's take a ride in the pickup here and let's start at this corner and this corner and then back out to that corner. And so we're grazing half and leaving half. Inside, if I were to draw a circle like this, now assuming there's not a lot of terrain features or or things like that. If I were to draw a circle right like that, what do you think it would look like inside of that circle for grazing half and leaving half? And then what do you think it would look like when we get out to these back corners on graze periods as long as 30 and 60 days? Okay? So the half that we ate is probably 90% is going to be inside that circle. And the half that we didn't eat, probably 90% of it's going to be outside of that circle, right? So a lot of times when they say graze half, leave half, well, I ate everything inside this circle probably 2 or 3 or 4 times, and the animals never touched anything out here. Okay? So it's really an example of undergrazing and overgrazing happening side by side. Okay? So let's start addressing some of the things that we could do on this ranch. Now, the first key point I want to make is that before you start thinking about improving your grazing management and dividing these things, we have to look into the economics. What if he'd looked into his economics and he'd figured out his gross margin was negative? Okay? For every additional animal he ran, he spent more on direct costs. And what if he never bothered to look into the economics and just went out and started building fence and putting in water and said, I need to take this 400 head cow herd and I need to turn it into 600 head or 800 head? Well, he'd go broke faster, wouldn't he? Okay. So we have to figure out which of the 3 secrets is the primary issue and address that first. We don't just want to go out and start putting in fence and developing water and getting good at our grazing until we figure out the business fundamentals. Okay. So let's do that. Let's say he has figured those things out like we've got here, and now we're going to go out and get good at our grazing. Okay, so we talked about addressing the number of herds. So 4 herds. Might there be some different classes of animals he could run? Might there be ways to take the current class he's running and figure out ways to combine some herds? Okay, would there be downsides to that? Absolutely, there probably would be downsides to it. If he's really good at developing his own heifers and he's got his heifers over here, his 3-year-olds over here, maybe a group of, he's splitting his mature cows out into middle-aged and old cows. Is there going to be some animal performance given up by making those? Okay, I would bet probably so. But let's say we're going to look at the economics of that, but let's find a way to reduce those number of herds. Okay, now I'm just going to go out on a limb here and I'm going to say this guy's going to go in and look at things and say, you know what, I figured out what makes me the most money are those middle-aged cows. So I'm going to sell all my heifers at weaning. I'm going to get rid of some of these old cows, and I'm just going to run one group of middle-aged cows because that's where the best margin on my whole ranch is. Okay, so now we've taken these 20 pastures. We haven't built a single fence yet. We probably had to develop some water that was going to allow that water system to support more animals. And we've got it down into 1 herd. So we effectively have 20 pastures per herd. Okay, if we're looking at that same 300-day grazing season, let's divide that by the 20. So now we're talking 15-day graze periods, okay? So we've made some pretty substantial changes. If we're talking about going through there twice, 180 divided by the 20, now I could have just divided it. Now we're down to the 9-day graze periods, okay? So we've made some substantial changes. I'm guessing if this person looked at this ranch and said, you know, are there some easy ways to divide these pastures up without a lot of cost that would help get that animal distribution improved and get those animals where they need to be, he'd really find some ways to do that. Let's say we could take these 20 pastures and without a lot of cost, without a lot of effort, we could turn those into 30 pastures. So now we've got 30 pastures and 1 herd running through there. And let's say we're talking about 2-pass grazing season, 180 days divided by the 30 pastures. Okay, now we're looking at a 6-day graze period across those. Okay. Now I've been talking about grazing period, and that's probably a mistake because graze period isn't the place to start when you start looking at your grazing season. Okay. I wish you guys were on here and I could see you and you could respond because I bet some of you are in the back screaming, well, what about recovery period? What about recovery period? And you're absolutely right. The first place to start when you start looking at these things and start focusing on it is let's look at that recovery period. Okay, if we don't get anything else right, if we get the recovery period right, things will really come together. Okay? So let's focus on the recovery period first. And I enjoyed the conversations I had with the MaiaGrazing folks on the front end because they were talking about principle-based grazing programs. Okay? And I imagine a lot of you are like I am, and you hear all these names thrown around of different names for these grazing systems, right? And it really kind of drives me nuts, because instead of focusing on named grazing systems, let's focus on principles, and let's agree what those principles are. And one of the principles that we teach in the Ranching for Profit School is let's get the recovery period right. Okay? And that recovery period is going to vary based upon the season. It's going to vary based upon, you know, how the rainfalls come and all those things. So let's focus on getting that recovery period right. And then we can shift to graze period. Okay? So I've been talking here about graze period, but I would be remiss if I didn't back up and emphasize recovery period as the place to start. All right, so let's take this same ranch, which started off with these 60 and 30-day graze periods, and now we've moved it down to as small as a 6-day graze period. And we've got these same pastures, okay? And maybe some of them have been divided up a bit more. We got these same pastures, and they've got a water system in the middle right here, and maybe one of these got a subdivision here, and they built a nice water block around the water point here. Okay? And now we're in here for 6 days, and maybe we're going to come over here, and it's going to be, you know, maybe it's a smaller pasture. We'll be in there for 3. Okay? So before, where those animals were spread out around the water, if we started drawing the animals on this pasture, and now remember, we took these 4 herds and we grouped them into 1 herd. So we're going to have the 4 times the number of animals in here. And then we took this pasture and divided it in half. So really it's going to have 8 times the stock density inside this pasture. Okay. So do you think the amount of feed, now when he talks graze half, leave half, I think what that rancher probably means is I shoot for moderate grazing intensity. So if we're shooting for moderate grazing intensity in here, do you think it's going to look a bit different when grazed in this way than the way we started with those few animals spread out around? And you think the grazing distribution is going to look a bit more uniform out here in these back corners? Maybe there's still going to be some more pressure up here by the water point, but not anywhere to the degree that it was. Do you think it might be realistic to think we're going to, of the feed that grows, we're going to get a larger portion of that feed in the belly of a grazing animal so that it could be converted to something we can sell? Yeah. I would think so. We call that harvest efficiency. Is that what I was just talking about there? Harvest efficiency is the percent of the feed, the total feed that grew that year, that actually ends up in the belly of that grazing animal. And one of the principles is as we shorten graze period, we increase harvest efficiency. Okay? So more of that feed ends up in the belly of an animal. And then as we think about, okay, 6-day graze period, what has that done to the recovery period? Now, it used to be grazed for 30 or 60, and I assume that was being grazed during some key months of the growing season, and now we've been able to reduce that down to 6. So if it was 30 and now it's 6, well, there's 24 more days of growing season that pasture now has to grow without the presence of domestic livestock. Okay? So do you think it might grow more feed? So I think it's pretty realistic to say we're going to expect an increase in carrying capacity. Now let's jump back to the numbers. So he had $225,000 of overheads, okay? $225,000 of overhead costs. And he had a gross margin of $425 per cow. Okay? And he was coming up about $55,000 short. Well, let's see, what would it take just to cover the overhead costs? So I'm going to take the $225,000 and divide that by the 425 grazing animals. And I see that to cover the overhead costs, I need about 529 females with that gross margin just to cover my overhead costs. Okay. So if I started with 400, I'm going to take that 529 and divide it by the 400. Okay, and that gives me 132%. So that he needs a 32% increase in the number of animals that he's carrying in order to cover his overhead costs. Okay. Now, I've helped a lot of folks put these kind of systems into place, and I've got to witness a lot of the results of these. And I'll tell you right now, 32% is pretty darn conservative when you get good at your grazing. Okay. If this person were to take that ranch that we just described, to lump those animals into 1 herd, to divide the pastures that were easy to divide, to develop the water that needed to, 32%, he could do that in his sleep. And a lot of our clients, and I think Maia could speak to this as well. I'll be curious what Bart says when I stop talking. A lot of our clients are getting somewhere between 50 and 200% increases in carrying capacity. So I'll be interested to see what Bart's numbers are. But let's say he'd be tickled if he could just cover his overhead costs on this ranch. After all, that'd be like making $55,000 more a year. So there's one strategy to do it. Now, we talked about the economic leverage of doing this. Okay? So the economic leverage of getting good at his grazing, would there be other ways he could run 529 animals and continue grazing them the way that he has? Well, sure. Okay, we could go out and we could lease a ranch. Maybe it's going to be 20 miles from the headquarters. Maybe when we lease that ranch, we're going to have somebody else there now to take care of things. Probably going to take on a whole other set of utilities. Well, if we buy a ranch, well, maybe we can do that with dollars sitting somewhere else. But even when we own that ranch, we're going to have upkeep and maintenance and all the things that come along with that. So in going that way, what do you think would happen to these overhead costs? Okay. Well, the overhead costs, when you expand that way, are likely to increase drastically. Now, I'm not saying that putting in grazing infrastructure and these kind of things are going to have no effect on those overhead costs. But let's look for ways where we can invest a little bit of money and get a big return. In fact, in the school, we teach a rule that if we're going to invest in something new, we want it to give 100% return on the investment in 1 year. Okay. Now, not everything that we look at can do that, but if you start looking at your ranch, every business that I've ever worked with, there is something sitting out there that if you invested in it would give you 100% ROI in 1 year. Okay. So if you start looking, what is it in your business? So there's some real leverage, economic leverage in getting good at your grazing, figuring out ways to improve turnover, assuming you have a good gross margin and assuming you've worked on the overhead. So with that, I think that's probably laid some foundation for some good discussion. I'd be remiss if I didn't share with you our upcoming Ranching for Profit schools that are going to be happening throughout the year. So, but you can certainly find those on the website there at the bottom too. So I'll stop talking, and I'm looking forward to hearing from some of the others and having some discussion with you guys.
Well, thank you, Dallas. I'm guessing everyone can hear me and see me, and someone will let me know if you can't. Very good. Yeah, Dallas, look, I just feel like I poured a nice warm bath, put some Epsom salts in, grabbed myself a beer, and had a very enjoyable half an hour. It's a shame I've got to get out of the bath now and actually do a bit of work. But look, that was fantastic. There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, I love the way that you've had the freedom to scribble on the screen. You're a man of my own heart. That's just the way I love to do these things. So thanks very much. Look, there's a bunch of stuff there to unpack, and I can see we've got a bunch of people from a whole different group of worlds listening in today. So Dallas, I think it'd be just great to just dive into a few things there and actually get some conversation going around how this stuff works, right? Because it's the doing it, right? So I'm thinking about how you do what you do, and I'm thinking about our friends at RCS in Australia and the other HM consultants around the US, and I'm thinking, and I've watched Dave Pratt for years and years, and I'm thinking to myself, the aha moment, right? Because what you've just run through there is not crazy coming from Mars and some newfangled amazing spaceship stuff. This is actually fundamentally principle-based good management, right? And we've got this small percentage of the grazing world or the farming ranching world that say, you know what, Dallas, you're on the money, let's do it, or we are doing it. And that's because there's a bunch of people that haven't had their aha moment, or they haven't had that process of going through some learning and actually just gaining what we might call both financial and grazing literacy, if you like. So just to bring that to some thoughts here. As I see it, the people that go through the kind of principle-based training that you're talking about there have a shift between their ears, first and foremost, right? So there's this shift of going from I'm busy, I've got a bunch of activities that define me around the farm, to if they get there, right, I run a business that happens to do those things. You know, I've got a business that happens to be a grazing operation that runs livestock, and there's a bunch of activities there, and sometimes I get smashed by the weather, and sometimes I have a win. Sometimes markets are good, sometimes they're not, but it's the business of actually, it's the process of running that business that's the key thing. So I guess my question is, right, well, let's have a question. So people who have those moments or that progression from seeing the farm as a set of activities to those who see it as actually running a business, they have that aha moment. To what extent do you think that it's about gaining that literacy? It's about gaining some understanding of what it is that they're looking for in those numbers, because you just ran through a bunch of beautiful numbers on the screen there with the grazing, you know, the stuff I love. To what extent is that the limiting factor here? You know, that understanding of the numbers and the grazing numbers and where they come from.
Yeah. You mentioned a bunch of things there, Bart. Got me thinking on several different directions. You know, you talk about the aha moment and flipping the light switch, and it's a word that's overused, but the word paradigms, and you mentioned it, and it really relates to how do we see the world? What's the filter through which we're looking at things, right? The paradigm, and for most folks, the ranch is their life, and the ranch is what they do, the farm or the ranch, and it's always been their job, and it's a change of paradigm to say this ranch is actually going to be a business, and I want business outcomes from this ranch, right? That there's almost a mentality that if we work hard and we show up every day and we get up early and we bust our butt, that we're entitled to a living, okay? And I think that's a really unfortunate way of thinking about it, right? Yeah. I mean, nobody's entitled to anything. You get up and instead of going outside to bust your buns at working at things that have failed year after year after year, let's work at taking a fresh look at it, and let's work at taking this ranch that we've always known apart and chunking it into things that we can get our hands around, and turning it over and taking a look at how it's working economically and how it's working for the people. I mean, are we able to have a life and a ranch, or are we just able to have a ranch and it takes us away from our life? Right. So taking a fresh look at these things, and the literacy part and the figuring it out. I've never seen somebody that wants to get it that hasn't been able to do that, right? I mean, once people have the motivations of, I'm willing to figure this stuff out. I mean, the people in agriculture are some of the smartest and brightest and most brilliant people in the world. And our businesses are not failing because we're not smart enough or because we don't work hard enough. A lot of these businesses are failing because people don't have the right things to work on. Okay, so we're working on the things over here while the things that really need to be done are going left undone. And oftentimes it's because nobody ever taught us how to do those things. They're the scary, they're the unknown things. So I think for a lot of people, the aha is that change of paradigm, changing that filter through which we're looking at our business, at our ranch. And then once we change that paradigm, I mean, you know, you can figure it out. The figuring out how to do good grazing is really not that difficult. Figuring out how to look at your business economically is not that difficult.
Okay, yeah, well, I think I'm with you, but why aren't more people doing it then?
Because it hasn't been necessary.
Yeah.
If you can continue doing the same thing you've done year after year, and you're able to pay your bills, you're able to cash flow, you know, why stop and look at it? So the letter that we just read and went through, that's probably one of the most common impetus for changes is Sure. They want to bring the next generation back to the business, right?
Sure.
So we have a ranch and we want it to support another family. So now we have to look at it with a fresh perspective and say, well, if we're going to ask it to do more, we're going to have to look at it differently.
Yeah, sure, and I'd agree with that totally. I mean, the number of instances where people make those you know, fundamentally massive shifts to the way that they think about the business and the way they run the business doesn't come from time in the sun on a beautiful Sunday. It comes from a tough run. It comes from, you know, fundamentally losing some skin and having a tough time for a month, a year, or a few years, drought, market-based, whatever it might be, people-based, family-based, succession. There's so many different reasons for that, as folks on the call would really relate to. So and it was a tongue-in-cheek question, right? Because it does become bleedingly obvious when you think through those principles of change and shifting the things between your ears to reassess how and why you're doing what you're doing and finding your why for what it is. So my next question then is, right, I mean, there's a bunch of different aha moments, right? There's some beautiful moments that we see and experience in our roles, watching people, learn to see what an ADA means, or a pound per acre, 1,000 pounds per acre, or a 100 SDH in Australia. That's a great aha moment, and then sort of relating to the burn down of the feed that I've got in this non-growing season, or the close season, or my winter, and then getting that principle of recovery that you started to sketch out there, and put those numbers together. That's a beautiful set of aha moments. And I guess I'm wondering then, because that to me is that's the sexy part, right? That's where we all want to be, and we all want to spend more time, or at least, as long as we've got the rest of the fundamentals right and we're rocking. But even before that, is it a case, I think, because I'm just trying to reconstruct this in my mind now, why isn't this easier for so many people? And there's this sort of disconnect where so we realise that we've got to run the business rather than do the activity. And is it then a realisation, do you think, that people haven't got they haven't had the training or the understanding of what the numbers actually mean? So then it becomes a bit big and a bit hard and a bit broad, and it can be a bit confronting if you've got a few $1 million on the table with a farm, multi-generational, and a bunch of numbers are going up on the screen that you're not familiar with. That can be confronting.
Sure. Yeah. And it is learning a new language. I mean, we talk about these things like gross margins and overheads and gross product. And I remember the first time I went to the Ranching for Profit school, and I was scratching my head one day and I'm like, I can't remember if I'm talking gross margin or gross product. And, it was overwhelming for me. And it is for a lot of folks too, as you start to learn those things. So yeah, I kind of relate to it as, when I was in high school, I enjoyed a little bit of high school rodeo, and I worked at this feedlot, and we had a pen in the back with some Corriente cattle that the owner bought. And every now and then we got to back our horses in there and have some fun roping these Corrientes at night. And I'd never done any roping inside of a pen. And if you've ever been to a team roping and you're the worst guy there, or you're the new guy at the team roping, it's not a very comfortable feeling, right? So I talk about being the guy at the team roping that sucks. Okay. Yeah. And I think sometimes when people are learning this stuff, they feel like I'm the guy at the team roping that sucks. Right?
Yeah, I should know this, right? But why am I the dumb one? Yeah. So you're saying got to make it okay to be. You got to make it okay to be the guy that just doesn't know.
Yeah. I mean, everybody's where they're at, and there's no judgment on that. And I think that's one of the things we try to do is we create a space where, and I appreciate this. When I walk into Teach Your Ranching for Profit school, we usually have 48 to 55 people in the room, and some of these people haven't set foot in a classroom since they were in high school. And so we have to make it a welcoming environment where everybody's where they're at. And you know what, guys, we're going to figure this stuff out together. And if we can take you from here and move you to here, great. So it's, but it can be an intimidating thing.
Yeah. And you're reminding me really that as much as I love the numbers and the science and the data that drives all this, it's actually about people, right? So, and it always will be. And, we're in the software game, and we just have to constantly remind ourselves that this is about people and their familiarity with numbers and how people think. And it's actually, at the end of the day, all about familiarity. And then it's just not an issue. All of the things that you were drawing up on the board there before. So, okay, let's leave the aha moments. And there's a bunch there, and I think I'd love to get some shares from other people along the way with that, because that's a great, just that would be a lovely couple of hours to spend working through that, because that's what's holding a lot of people back, right? So the next thought then, just unpacking your presentation and those slides, the slides in that case study. And again, look, those numbers, they ring true, and I can put a few up, and we can talk about that in a second. But you know what? It's easy to forget when you're in the middle of this and we're doing it, but the upside here is enormous. That's what strikes me, that the trillions of dollars that are tied up in farming, in agricultural land, the working capital that's running around on top of that. It's mind-boggling, the upside, right? Because and I question why, why is there all this upside? Why are we still kind of moping around down the bottom, wondering how to pay the overheads, like you were explaining in that case study? And I think it's because there aren't the numbers. This is my guesstimate, and I'm looking for your thoughts on this. Again, it comes back to the data, right? Because I've spent a lot of time with folks who go from zero to hero. They become very proficient at the things we've just talked about. They have their aha moments. They become pretty good. They become the dudes. They become, what we're going to call fantastic graziers. And then I'll sit down with them, or we'll get around the farm and we'll look at how things are progressing. And I can just imagine some other people on the call here, Roland and others in this same position, and Tom Hungerford and the RCS guys. We're spending time with graziers who know these things, and then they kind of instinctively then realise that they're seeing shifts, ecological succession, that whole fundamental shift in how a farm runs and operates. And then you'll ask them, so how's it going? We're looking at a cell over here, and we're seeing, it was one big paddock, 1,000 acres or whatever it is. And we're looking at it now 5 years later, and there's all this change. We've got succession, we've got photos, we've got monitoring points, we've got excitement, we've got real change happening. We've got the whole biological thing with the earthworms and the dung beetles and all the stuff that we really want to get out there and start chewing into. And I'll ask these folks, so what's the return? And it'll tend to be a mixed bag depending on their level of obsession with data, I guess, right? So there are some who, I mean, at the end of the day, the answer is going to be somewhere, in my experience, it's typically been, look, maybe 20 to 50% is what we're seeing. It's kind of, if I looked at this cell here, I reckon we've picked up maybe 20, 50%. And in each of those cases, when I've actually sat down with them and we've actually looked at the data because we've got the data, right, and we've taken the time to go and pull that data apart, and whether it's a few hundred grazers or a lot of grazers for that bit of country, we actually pull it apart and we work it out, and we work out what some of those numbers you talked about before were there, duration, recovery, density, and then the yield per inch of rainfall, the yield per 100 mils of rainfall. And typically it blows them away when we actually do that. And it's going to be anywhere from 50 to 300%. I was doing some numbers recently where, it's never been less than 50%. It's usually double, right? And so that's what I'm saying, guys, we need to get more excited about this. There's more upside than we think. And it's actually just come from getting a handle on recovery, increasing density, knowing our duration, graze periods, and harnessing this beast to then get yield. And I think people are kind of getting a bit complacent about that. And again, I'm going to come to a question here somewhere if I can sort of form it up. And I'm led to the underlying belief that that's because of a lack of data. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So what you're saying is, if you ask him to just give you a hip pocket number, the rancher's going to tell you 20, 30% increase. But when you actually go back in the data and ferret that out, it's somewhere between 50 and to 200% increase. Definitely. So it's never been less than 50. Interesting.
Yeah. When we actually look at the numbers, and I'd love to get my little scribbler out here and draw a few, but I don't need to. I mean, you covered it, right? But I was looking at some numbers that I gave at a presentation very recently. It's not uncommon, right? We've gone from 5% recovery, so 5% of days recovered in this particular cell that I was pulling apart for these guys, to 90% of days rested. We've gone from 0.4 lactating cows per acre per day to 12, I think it was. I've got it here somewhere. Yeah, 12 lactating cows per acre per day. Change in recovery periods, and then the yield response was 50 pounds per acre per inch precipitation, and spent $50 an acre once to get $60 an acre per year thereafter. Like, that's pretty exciting, right? I mean, then you start to say, well, okay, let me leverage that. Am I going to start thinking about buying next door for $1,000 a DSE area, or whatever that equates to? Let's call it $80 a beast area, which I must admit is, in that particular example, the back of a volcano, Stu, if you're listening, with some beautiful country. But I could spend $80 an acre buying next door with the overhead that's going to require, or with the fencing that was done there, the water and wire, and admittedly some pretty bloody good management, I'm buying that same beast area for what, $5 or $6, $7 an acre. Well, I'm not buying it, but I'm gaining that result. Yeah. And I think that's something that, you know, that keeps me awake. I'm pretty excited about that. And I'm wondering why we aren't doing more of that, because is it, and again, it's back to this question, you know, is there enough data? And I'm a bit pent up on this because I love the data, and you know, Maia is all about the data, and it's all about how we get that in there, and we become familiar with the process of running around the farm, doing what we do, capturing the data by just doing what we do, so that it pops out the other end and we say, you know what, my return on that was pretty cool. My return over there was a little bit poorer. My return over there was even better, because we're refining it and reviewing it. Now, I just wondered what your experience there in the States is with that client base of yours, and that level of literacy that they gain. How inherent is that in the folks that you spend time with?
You know, as you've been talking through that, I've been thinking about the folks that I work most closely with, which is our executive link group, and a lot of those folks come to the EL meetings and say, you know, hey, we've increased our carrying capacity by this much, and we're now running this many animals, and it's been this a % increase. But there's very few, I can think of a few, but there's very few that walk in and put it in front of their EL boards and say, let me show you what our historic, you know, carrying capacity and stocking rate has been for the last 5-7 years, and this is the trend line that we're creating, and this is what our management is doing. And I would really like to see more people walking in with those kind of numbers, because right now we're just kind of taking their word for it, right? When they come in and say, well, we've increased stocking rate carrying capacity by 50%, right?
Well, you're talking my world, Dallas. I mean, and that's what Maia was built for, right? I mean, we're not here to talk about that, but we're here to really, we need to pin some results to something that we can tangibly say, you know what, I'm going to spend $1 million with a great deal of confidence here, and not just anecdotal. And I think that's the opportunity, right? I mean, and I can see Coles in the background there, which means I'm going to get wound up pretty shortly, because we could keep going here for hours. But I had a bunch of other questions, but that can come in another session. But I'm just, and Cole, you can tell me if I'm actually not getting wound up here, because then I can keep talking. But I'm thinking, Dallas.
No, you're getting wound up.
I'm thinking, Dallas, that because time is a construct, right, fellas? I mean, it doesn't matter where we are in the world right now. It's time. The time is different for all of us, so it's actually a construct, and we can just keep on talking for a minute. The issue here is an information gap. You know, I'm looking at a great example of an information gap right now is what I'm seeing is absolutely nuts on the US stock exchange, right? But there's this gap between what people are prepared to do and what the fundamentals are telling them. And that can only be based on what I think is fundamentally an information gap. And I'm seeing the same thing in how people run their farms. And again, for me, it comes back to that accessibility and relationship to data, and then being able to communicate that to others, whether it be Dallas, whether it be the other people on their EL board, that fantastic process that we see in Australia as well. That means that you can communicate with confidence what you're doing, how you're doing it, why you're doing it, and what the damn result is. And then you're getting away from ideology, and you're getting away from what people are saying down the pub. You're actually talking numbers. And that's, to me, that's the sexy part of this.
Let me share with you a thought that we do at the school that kind of tidy that up. We ask the question, are you an amateur rancher or are you a professional rancher? And if you think about sports, amateurs do what? We pay to play. Right?
Pay to play.
And professionals
get paid
to play. Yeah. And just like in sports, there's amateur ranchers and there's professional ranchers, and what is the relationship that you bring to your ranch? And so if you're a professional rancher, what are some of the expectations going to be? So, I mean, one of the key metrics are the things you're talking about, right? Stock days per acre per inch of precip. And so if you're a professional, if you're a CEO of a multi-million-dollar business, wouldn't you be expected to report on the key metrics of your business?
That makes sense.
So why do we not expect ranchers to do that? Should we?
Yeah, well, that is another conversation. I don't know how we got to almost the end of the hour here, but that I think you did right. And the bigger the business, the more corporate the business becomes, rather than being that family-oriented but yet corporate discipline operation, which I see as being the best model out there. But the more corporate they become, the more the tendency tends to be to fiduciary duty rather than strategic decision making around opportunity and return on capex for the season that we're in right now, and being agile to move with that. But that's another conversation, and that's another chat for another day.
Look, I am going to have to jump in, guys. Look, we've got everyone still hanging in on the call, so it's a bit of a gut call that we just need to get to a couple of questions that are coming through, because everyone needs to get on with their evening or their day or what have you. But I think it's been a great conversation. We've gone all over the place, but at the same time come up with some really poignant insights. And I think both of you have sort of referred to a couple of times that there's many other conversations to come, and I think that's the intention of this webinar series. And so we're going to hook up with Dallas again and all our other partners and friends around the planet to talk about such things. But we've got some really good chatter amongst all the participants on the sidelines. I threw it out there to all participants, start sending you questions through, and people are chatting on the sidelines, which is absolutely fantastic. And we'll go through all of those threads after the call, the three of us, and ensure that we can follow up with any direct questions insights that come out of that to share with everyone else. But there have been a few questions that have come through referring back to that case study, I guess, Dallas, that you threw up at the front end. One question was in regards to that harvest efficiency. Roland, Montana, good to see you on the call. Thank you. He said you started off the session stressing soil health, but in relation to harvest efficiency, how much plant material should we plan on returning to the soil surface, and how do you plan to make this happen? Thanks, Roland.
Yeah, that's a great question, Roland. And as Roland well knows, it's a complex set, right? And I don't think there's a standard issue. There's been times when I've grazed stuff severely, and it has come back very healthy and looks wonderful. And there's been times when I've grazed stuff lightly and even through some hooves put things on the ground, and it hasn't looked as good. So I think severity of graze is an important component, but I think most traditional grazing managers tend to overestimate the importance of severity of use. So I mean, I guess the question, Roland, and I think you'd be better one to answer this than I in some ways, is there's certainly a benefit of returning things to the soil, and I'm not by any means suggesting people graze their whole ranch severely, but I think there's getting the other principles right as well, right? The rest amount of time that we're getting recovered, the hoof action that helps return that to the soil. Those are all components as well. And then we haven't even talked about animal performance today, right? And overlaying those animal performance objectives, and when can we ask animals to do that in their production cycle, and winter times that we need to manage. I mean, I think there's times on my place when I'm managing for the animals, and there's times I do things that from a landscape perspective that I'm not real proud of. But sometimes we have to balance those competing results. So what a terrible answer, but it's a complex thing.
It is a complex thing, absolutely. Another one from Mick. Good to have you on the call, Mick. You're not there just with your feet up, you're participating. Mick's asking, and I guess a bit of a question for both of you guys. We hear numbers quoted from the states of massive stock density per hectare or per acre with production animals. Where do you think the line is with regard to stock density and animal performance? And I guess it's a balancing act there.
I'll take a crack at it, Bart, and you can have at it. I guess I'm always, wherever I think that line is, I go see somebody that's proven me wrong. Last summer, I had the opportunity to go to spend a day with John Locke, south of Houston, Texas, on the Gulf Coast, and he's pretty active on Facebook. Some of you have probably seen some of the things he's doing. Sometimes running at well over 1 million pounds per acre with a production class of purebred Brahman cattle that need to hit production targets, and he's getting really strong production results. Land health is just through the roof. Things that I would have told you had I not seen it were not practical. So I don't know that I know where the line is.
Yeah, look, I won't be able to add a lot to that. That's not going to involve a lot longer answer. I've learned, I love the idea of a couple of single numbers. It's at least this and it's maximum that. And I think I'm in the same camp as Dallas, that the more numbers I see, and I see a lot of numbers, and a lot of grazers are in a lot of different ecosystems, and every ecosystem is slightly different from paddock to pasture to cell to property to region. And, you know, I've seen some numbers that make me think, okay, when we're finishing and we're trying to put on that 15 mil of consistent fat, it's a different story to when we've got a couple of old cows or a lot of old cows that are trying to do a job for us on the landscape, and it's obviously got some massive differences there. But even then, I've seen a spectrum, if you like, between animals that are on finishing country and that line at which we thought, no, that's actually going to impede animal performance, whether it's 70 head per hectare or 100 or 120. And it seems to vary from ecosystem to ecosystem. And this is part of the problem. But at the same time, that's actually, for me, I mean, I'd love to give you a simple, bang, concrete answer, Mick, but the fact is, this is where management comes in. This is where people come in. This is where the ability to discern and learn from the system that we're in personally in our farm, and our farm giving us numbers, and hoping that we can learn from those numbers before we make too big a mistake that we get too hurt. But that's really what it's going to come down to. Is actually, I mean, I've done this with Stu, who's on the call there, where we've said, righto, we just went through the last couple of kills on a finishing job, and looking at the actual result, and then comparing that to previous times, and what was the actual density and for the same class of country and the same class of feed. And you can see it definitely makes a difference, but it's about learning that for our farm and for the kind of class of animal that we're trying to do this with. So there's no easy answer. It actually means you've got to know your numbers, and you've got to know what you've got to get at. You've got to have a feedback loop. That's the deal.
Thanks, guys. There was a question. It's been sort of lost in the string there, but I'll sort of paraphrase. I think it was Alison referring to it, and again, one back to the case study, Dallas, just to sort of keep it on topic there. And it was in relation to, you know, really in that sort of case, in that sort of setup, in that context, how to sort of make that start to prioritising water and wire projects, and just unpacking that particular sort of experience, and how to guide that, you know, where to make that start and how to prioritise, I guess.
You know, I think I'd caution again to say, is the grazing improvement taking the ranch in the right direction? Is that where we want to go? Is that where this business wants to be headed? For some ranches, if you describe that, what they'd be building there, they'd say, you know what, I don't want to ranch that way, and that's not the kind of life I want. But if this ranch says, yeah, you know, we'd like to have profitability, you know, we would like to have these kind of animals, this stuff matches our thing, and this is the direction we want to go, then we start talking about, okay, so where are we going to spend the money? What's the most limiting? Is it water delivery? Is it storage capacity? For most of the ranches we work with, water is the place to start, right? Let's develop that capacity to start grouping animals up and delivering water consistently to them. The fencing's easy. I mean, the fencing is fairly inexpensive. You can take it down, you can put it up, and I'm not just talking about temporary wire, you know, even permanent wire. But let's get the water right. Let's overbuild it from the beginning, because just like this person, they might budget for running 550 head, and here 3 years in, now they're up to 800 head, right? You don't want to have to go pulling out 1 3/4 inch pipe to go putting in 2.5 inch pipe. So let's overbuild it from the beginning. Yeah, so just some comments to share. The best way to do these things is to get people around, right? Involve people, get a map up there, start drawing stuff out and saying, well, we could put it here, we could put it here, and then erase everything and start from scratch and just say, all right, now let's build it again from scratch. What might it look like? Don't constrain yourself to what's there. One of the worst things to do is to draw all the fences as they are now, and then to say, okay, now how are we going to add to this, right? That how they are now might screw up your thinking entirely. So just take the ranch, draw it out there, and start thinking without boundaries to your thinking about where might things be, and then put the budget numbers to it. Okay, so what would it cost to put this in? What would it cost to do this? And then look at it from return on investment. Where's going to be our greatest return on investment? Let's do a phase 1 first. Let's build it to be expandable off of that, and start getting these things down. And then I think there's something to be said for just doing it. Sometimes analysis paralysis can stop people, but my gosh, after you've looked at it for a while, go out and put something in the ground, right? Let's get something moving. Let's get some land improvement going. We'll start getting people excited, and then we're ready to roll on. So.
I'll just add in very quickly there, Cole, that totally on the money with Dallas, you know, and expect to be surprised. Like, I think this is like, just do it. Yeah, love it. But expect to be surprised on the upside, not the downside. So always be expecting to go a bit further than you thought you might have been able to, and to use design principle rather than copying what someone else has done. It's got to be based on design principle and bring in those fundamentals that Dallas talks about there, and on the right track. All right.
I think that's really great, and just made me think that just next week, actually, Alison, and for anyone else listening, we're running another webinar roughly this time next week. Though we'll ensure that everyone on the call gets the details of it. But we're running a session next week, being led by Jim Garish, on paddock design, on fence design, and no doubt water's going to be coming into that too, knowing Jim. So yeah, keep your eye out for that one. That could be good to see on next week, and again, that'll be recorded. There's a whole lot of other questions sort of coming on around that sort of theme, but one coming back to data, and Bart, probably throw to you, and this might have to be our last question just with time, but what's the most important data to gather in regards to measuring grazing performance improvement, and how do I know that I'm making progress? I guess this is our sweet spot, Bart, but I'll leave it to you to have a stab.
Yeah, look, I was going to try and come up with something really clever. I don't think it needs to be. I think if you're tracking your grazers, so if you can keep your demand up to date, so demand means, classes of animals in herds and mobs moving around between paddocks under some greater plan of achieving the goals that Dallas walked us through there before. If you're tracking demand, you're tracking where those animals are, where that demand is to the supply. So you're tracking demand and supply. It's not going to take a long time before each pasture and each paddock and each group of paddocks and land type and property tells a story. So it's actually coming from the graze. So time, space, demand, we've got it. It's really not that hard. It's the grazing chart, right? So, and then it's about harvesting from the grazing chart what can be some pretty prolific data as easily as physically possible, and that's part of the challenge here. But if we're doing it right, that's the fun part, and it doesn't actually need to be difficult. So, and that's where we need a team where we're not just moving animals, but we're tracking how we move the animals. We're tracking what we think's in that pasture when we go into it, and we're tracking what we think is in there when we come out of it. And we know what the animals have actually just harvested, right? So we've got this beautiful feedback loop machine that is actually better than any modelling that the Bureau of Met's going to come up with, or Department of Ag. We've actually got a pasture production supply and demand model unfolding in front of us, and every time we do a graze, we're adding to that model. And that's our own model for our farm, for our few $1 million tied up in this asset. So it's about the grazing chart, and it's about keeping that up to date, to be honest.
So it's all about, the role of technology, MaiaGrazing in this instance, and as simple as if you've got a phone, then you've got the ability to get that feedback loop straight away, and things just bubble on in the background. Dallas, do you have anything to sort of add to that? Because we'll need to sort of wrap things up just right now.
I just wrote down, I'd like to see long-term trends on carrying capacity, and then I'd like to see some kind of long-term indication of land health. So, coupled in, what's the stocking rate, what's the carrying capacity, and then trend monitoring on land health.
Yeah, I can't let you wrap up there, Cole, because Dallas has just picked up on my shortcoming. Right? I'm focused in on let's harvest this sort of granular per graze per bit of land supply and demand equation, right? Because that's the stuff that we love. Yeah. At the end of the day, you wrap all that up, you link it to the environment that you're in, the season that you're in, the rolling precipitation. You've actually got a story unfolding there at a whole of property level or a whole of land class level. That means that you can actually say, righto, where are we? Where is our stocking rate to carrying capacity, as so many folks, will be familiar with, so that we have a story to tell, and we can communicate that within ourselves to those that are invested in this farm, whether it's the bank or the partners or the whoever. That's the bit that matters.
Well, thanks so much. And I mean, the whole topic of today was, gaining economic leverage with planned grazing. I think, we've addressed a lot of the sort of the fundamentals. It's a huge topic. It's endless. There's, I think, just the chatter between ourselves as well as all the participants chatting on the sidelines there clearly is displayed. We've sort of touched a nerve here, really, and I think there's that what can fall out of this is probably another 3 or 4 deliberate themed sort of sessions. So let's put our heads together and get it on the timeline and share it with the audience. But you know, I think the observation that I've made on the sideline chatter with all participants has really been around the lines of people knowing that they want to make a start, but it's a lot of that fear of making the start and knowing where to start and having the tools and having the support and what have you. But I can see a lot of energy there, and it's exciting to have run the session. And if anyone's got additional questions, keep sending them through. We'll go through all the sideline conversations and so forth with all the attendees and get back to everyone individually. If you just stay on the line now, we'll wrap up the session, but it'll flick to a page where you can just simply click on to learn more about ranching for profit, and it goes through to their profit tips page, which is absolutely fantastic. That's been running for years. I absolutely am a big fan of that. Also link through to MaiaGrazing, how you can set up a free consultation and a demo of MaiaGrazing, Q&A or what have you. But thanks so much for everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Hooray for Hollywood. Be good to your mother.